Hey everyone, quick context on why I'm doing this. I went through the Webb Bayview HOA survey recently, and there were several questions where I had to stop and reread them because I wasn't fully clear on what was being asked or where the impact would be. So I figured if I'm having that reaction, there are probably others in the community who may feel the same. I'm not affiliated with the board, and I'm not here to tell anyone how to respond. The goal is simply to walk through the survey question by question and translate it into plain English so residents can better understand what they're responding to. This is an absolute quick disclaimer. This walkthrough is based on my understanding of the survey and the governing documents, along with the use of AI as a tool to help translate things into plain English. I could be wrong on certain interpretations, so I'd encourage everyone to review the materials themselves or reach out to the board directly for clarification. This is just to make the questions easier to understand, not a legal interpretation or official guidance. So with that being said, let's go through it. For transparency, I've uploaded the survey itself as well as the CC&Rs, bylaws, rules, and regulations into the project. That way, if the question refers to an existing rule, the AI has that context available. Nothing is hidden here. This is just a structured way to make the survey easier. So the framework I'm using to guide the AI breaks it down into simple questions. So here's my additional context that I look at, say what is the purpose of what's going on here, the input method that I'm having. So for the folks that don't understand AI, you can kind of skip through this section. This is for the people that do understand AI, that actually understand what the context is and how I align the AI to respond appropriately and professionally in this type of scenario. So each response framework is going to be saying, okay, what is it in plain English? Here's what happens depending upon the responses. Who gains control or flexibility? Here's the problem we're trying to solve. And if there's something like this already exists inside the bylaws. And so basically this is our framework that we're using as our internal structure. And then additionally, I want to make sure that everybody's understanding that this is going to be neutral and factual. It's not to assume intent. It doesn't recommend how to respond, and it keeps responses consistent across all questions. So again, this is just the context that I give to the AI in order to be able to how to respond appropriately and professionally in order to give me the most clear message that I need to be able to make a proper decision when submitting the survey. So each survey question is going to be reviewed on, is this in plain English? What happens depending upon the response? Who gains decision-making power or flexibility? What problem is this trying to solve, right? Does anything like this already exist in the current HOA? What is one potential downside or concern? And is this question clearly written, or could it be misunderstood by residents? And then the last but not least is the financial impact, if there is any where applicable. So this is just a simple, consistent framework that I'm going to be asking for each question that's going to be popping up. So right here, I have my survey. This is the community survey that everyone's received. And if I recall correctly, I think this is due on May 4th of 2026. On the right-hand side here, you'll see all the sources that I've actually loaded into the ChatGPT engine to actually go ahead and use that as raw material that I can actually refer to. Hey Vivian, quick check before we start. Everything's loaded in the project, including the survey and governing documents. We're recording this live to walk through the survey question by question so residents can better understand what's being asked. Are you ready to go?
I'm ready. We've got the survey, the walkthrough framework, and the governing context lined up. I'll stay in translator mode. Clear, neutral, concise, and structured for a live walkthrough, just like the guide lays out by question. And I'll translate each one into plain English, explain impact, control, risks, and clarity. Tight and easy for residents to follow.
Perfect, thank you. So we've got the survey up right now. Question 1 and 2, of course, we can skip over because it's just asking for our full name and our address that we happen to live at. But section number 1 starts with question number 3. With respect to alcohol use on common property, excluding the Sailfish, and for your context, the Sailfish is our on-property restaurant, would you support the addition of the following language and it's wrapped in quotes, quote, as defined by the board in the rules and regulations, close quote. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This question is asking if you're okay letting the board define alcohol rules later through the rules and regulations, instead of locking the rules directly into the governing documents, depending on the response. If yes, alcohol rules can be changed more easily over time. If no, any changes would likely require a community vote. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board gains more control and flexibility to set and adjust alcohol policies. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It avoids having rigid rules that are hard to update as the community evolves. Here's whether something like this already exists. Some areas already rely on board-defined rules, but this would expand that approach to alcohol use. One potential downside is residents lose direct voting control over future alcohol rule changes. This may or may not be clearly written. It's a bit vague. Doesn't specify what rules might look like, just who controls them.
Okay, thank you. So let's go on to question number 4. If you voted yes, it looks like this is tied into question 3. It says to question 3 above. Which alcohol policy would you prefer? One is no alcohol at any time on common areas, and the second one is when Sailfish is closed, wine, beer, and alcoholic canned drinks, but no spirits allowed at any time. Glass containers are not permitted at any time in, on, or near the pool deck. This response pertains to the pool deck only. All other common areas, no alcohol permitted without the request for a special event approved by the board.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. If you agreed to give the board control in the last question, this asks which specific alcohol rule you'd prefer, either a full ban or a limited allowance when the restaurant is closed, depending on the response. The chosen option signals what kind of policy residents want the board to implement. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board still holds control, but this question guides how strict or flexible the rule should be. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's trying to balance social use of common areas with safety and liability concerns. Here's whether something like this already exists. There are already restrictions on food and drink in common areas, but this clarifies alcohol specifically. One potential downside is the second option is complex and may be interpreted differently by residents. This may or may not be clearly written. It's somewhat confusing, mixes pool rules with broader community rules in one option. Financial impact, not applicable.
Would there be a better way for having this question written?
Yeah, this one could definitely be cleaner. Right now, the issue isn't the intent, it's that it's trying to do too much in one question. It mixes policy choice, location, pool versus everywhere, and restrictions all together. A clearer way would be to separate the decisions. For example, first ask something like, which general approach to alcohol on common property do you prefer? Then keep the options simple. No alcohol allowed at any time, or limited alcohol allowed under defined conditions. Then, if they pick limited, follow up with a second question. What limits should apply? That's where you define things like beer, wine only, no glass, pool deck rules, etc. The benefit is people are making one decision at a time, instead of trying to decode a paragraph.
Perfect, thank you. The next section is animals, and so it's question number 5. Do you agree to the following clarification for a nuisance animal? And nuisance animal is in quotes. To include behavior that interferes with another resident's use and enjoyment of their property, including excessive barking, runs at large, bites or attempts to bite, repeatedly trespasses, or is not properly restrained. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This question is asking if you agree to clearly define what counts as a nuisance animal, including behaviors like barking, roaming, biting, or not being controlled, depending on the response. If yes, these behaviors become officially enforceable. If no, the definition stays more general or unclear. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board and management gain clearer authority to enforce animal-related issues. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It aims to reduce disputes by setting clear expectations for pet behavior. Here's whether something like this already exists. Nuisance concepts usually exist, but this adds specific examples for clarity. One potential downside is some terms like excessive could still be subjective and lead to disagreements. This may or may not be clearly written, overall clear, but a few terms are open to interpretation.
So would there be a better way to write this?
Yeah, this one is actually pretty close, but it could be tightened to reduce subjectivity. The main issue is words like excessive, repeatedly, and not properly restrained. Those can mean different things to different people. A cleaner version would keep the intent but add structure. Something like, a nuisance animal is defined as any animal that unreasonably interferes with another resident's use and enjoyment of their property, including but not limited to persistent or prolonged barking or noise, being off-leash outside permitted areas, aggressive behavior such as biting or attempting to bite, repeated unauthorized entry onto other properties. The improvement here is subtle but important. It replaces vague terms with more measurable or observable behavior.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Let's go on to question number 6, which is still in the animals section. So, approve the need to add language, and this one's wrapped in quotes. Animals must have a current license and be vaccinated per Manatee County requirements. Resident must be able to provide proof of current vaccination if requested.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if you agree that all pets must be licensed and vaccinated according to county rules, and that owners must show proof if asked depending on the response. If yes, this becomes an enforceable HOA requirement. If no, it stays less formal at the HOA level. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains clearer authority to request documentation and enforce compliance. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It helps ensure health, safety, and accountability for pets in the community. Here's whether something like this already exists. These requirements already exist at the county level, but this brings enforcement into the HOA. One potential downside is it adds administrative burden and potential enforcement friction with residents. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear and straightforward with little ambiguity.
Now, there is a question, could there be financial impact? Because if documents are required for every household, does that mean there's now a paperwork burden or a paper trail burden that's obligated now by the management company?
Yeah, that's a fair call out. There could be a soft financial impact, even if it's not explicitly stated. What's happening under the surface is this shifts the HOA from rules exist to rules must be verified. That usually means tracking records, responding to requests, and possibly maintaining a database of compliance. That can translate into more time spent by the management company, potential need for systems or storage, even if basic, possible increased management costs over time, depending on how strictly it's enforced. It's unlikely to be a major cost driver on its own, but it's not zero either, especially if enforcement becomes active rather than complaint-based.
Perfect, thank you. Let's go ahead and go to the next question, which is question number 7. Approve the need to add clarification on when the animal needs to be on a leash. And it says, in quotes, animal must be on a leash at all times when outside the home, with the exception of the dog park. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if all animals must be on a leash anytime they're outside the home, except when they're in the designated dog park, depending on the response. If yes, this becomes a clear, enforceable rule. If no, leash expectations may remain less defined. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains clearer enforcement authority over pet control in common areas. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It aims to improve safety and prevent incidents between pets and residents. Here's whether something like this already exists. Leash rules often exist locally, but this makes it explicit within the HOA. One potential downside is it removes flexibility for well-trained pets that owners may feel don't need leashes. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear and straightforward with minimal ambiguity.
Now, one question for you. There may be leash laws based upon Manatee County, which they actually referred to in the prior question. We haven't really truly defined leash, and the county may define e-collar as a leash. How does that apply to this question?
Good catch. It's exactly where things can get a little messy. Right now, this question just says must be on a leash, but it doesn't define what a leash is. So in practice, one of two things happens. Either the HOA defaults to whatever Manatee County defines as a leash, or the HOA interprets it on its own. If the county allows something like an e-collar under restraint, but the HOA or a board later interprets leash more strictly as a physical tether, you've got a conflict or at least confusion. So the real issue here is alignment. This question doesn't say, as defined by Manatee County, and it also doesn't define leash locally. That creates a gray area where enforcement could vary depending on interpretation. A cleaner version would explicitly tie it to the county definition or clearly define what counts and what doesn't. Otherwise, two residents could both think they're compliant, and only one actually is, depending on who's enforcing it.
Okay, which thank you for appreciate that. We'll lead into the next question, which is similar to the leash question, which is number 8. Do you agree with adding this statement to define a short leash to include not more than 8 feet maximum, and it says in parentheses, per Manatee County requirement, and then, however, when sharing the road or sidewalk with other residents, animals 5-foot maximum should be used? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is defining how long a leash can be, up to 8 feet normally, but shortened to 5 feet when near others on roads or sidewalks, depending on the response. If yes, leash length becomes a specific enforceable rule. If no, it remains less defined. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains clearer enforcement authority with measurable limits. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's meant to improve safety and control in shared spaces where close interaction happens. Here's whether something like this already exists. It references county standards, but adds a stricter rule in certain situations. One potential downside is it may be difficult to consistently enforce when someone should switch from 8 feet to 5 feet. This may or may not be clearly written, mostly clear, but when sharing is somewhat subjective.
One other question, the way it's written, because it's saying 5 feet maximum when you share the road, does that mean you have to carry a separate leash and change your dog on a leash? Because technically the leash is at a fixed length.
Yeah, that's a very real practical issue with how this is written. As written, it implies you need to comply with 2 different maximums depending on the situation. But it doesn't explain how to do that. And like you said, most leashes are fixed length. So in practice, this creates a few possible interpretations. You'd need an adjustable leash. You'd need to physically shorten / or control the leash, like holding it closer, or technically, you'd need a second shorter leash. But none of that is actually stated. That's the gap. The rule defines lengths, but not behavior or method of compliance. A cleaner version would say something like, leashes may not exceed 8 feet.
Okay, let's go to question number 9. Do you agree with maintaining the language currently in declarant documents prohibiting dog breeds that includes pit bulls/pit bull mix?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if you want to keep the current rule that bans certain dog breeds, specifically including pit bulls and pit bull mixes, depending on the response. If yes, the breed restriction stays in place. If no, it could be removed or changed in the governing documents. Here's who gains control or flexibility. A yes maintains the current restriction. A no could open flexibility for residents to own those breeds. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's intended to address perceived safety and liability concerns tied to specific breeds. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yes, this language is already in the declarant documents, and this vote is about keeping it. One potential downside is breed restrictions can be controversial and difficult to enforce, especially with mixed breeds. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear in intent, but pit bull mix can be subjective and hard to define.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So now we're going to go to the next section, which is called Community Enhancement. So this is question number 10. Would you like to see a monthly music event where residents can bring snacks and a bottle of wine to the driftwood and pool deck, if no glass, for a minimal cost to cover the musician? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if you'd support a recurring monthly social event with live music, where residents can bring their own food and wine, no glass, and pay a small fee to cover the performer depending on the response. If yes, the HOA may organize these events. If no, they likely won't move forward. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA or lifestyle team gains the ability to plan and host these events. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's aimed at increasing community engagement and social activity. Here's whether something like this already exists. Events may already occur, but this formalizes a recurring, structured version. One potential downside is not all residents may want noise, crowds, or shared space usage tied to events. This may or may not be clearly written, mostly clear, but minimal cost is undefined. Financial impact, likely small per event, but could add up depending on frequency and participation.
Now, one follow-up question to this that I do have is, does that mean then technically certain areas may be off limits because unless you pay a fee to get in? So for example, if it's the pool deck area and I wanted to go to the pool while they had a musician, would I have to pay to go enjoy the pool?
That's a really important nuance, and the question doesn't actually clarify that. As written, it suggests a paid event happening in shared spaces like the driftwood or pool deck, but it doesn't say whether access to those areas becomes restricted during the event. So there are two possible interpretations. The event is optional and common areas remain open to everyone as usual, or portions of the space are effectively reserved for paying participants during the event. Because it doesn't specify, that creates ambiguity. In practice, this would likely come down to how the board or management implements it, but from a resident perspective, your concern is valid. The question doesn't clearly say whether you're paying for the event experience or potentially paying for access to a space that's normally included in your HOA dues.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Let's go to question number 11. Are you satisfied with the appearance of the flowers in the common areas? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is simply asking if you're happy with how the landscaping flowers currently look in the shared community areas, depending on the response. If many say no, it may lead to changes or increased spending. If yes, things likely stay the same. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board uses this as feedback but keeps decision-making control. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It gauges resident satisfaction with current landscaping quality. Here's whether something like this already exists. Maintenance already exists. This is just a feedback check. One potential downside is it's subjective. Different residents may have very different expectations. This may or may not be clearly written, very clear and straightforward. Financial impact, indirect, could influence future budget increases depending on responses.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So now leading into question number 12, do you support an increase in the flower budget to accommodate more frequent seasonal changes and or increase in volume of flowers? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if you're willing to spend more HOA money to have more flowers or change them out more often in the common areas depending on the response. If yes, the landscaping budget may increase. If no, current levels likely stay the same. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board gains support to increase spending on landscaping. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's aimed at improving the visual appeal and keeping landscaping fresh year-round. Here's whether something like this already exists. There's already a flower budget. This would expand it. One potential downside is higher costs without a defined limit or clear expectation of results. This may or may not be clearly written, clear in intent, but doesn't specify how much the increase would be. Financial impact? Yes, likely higher HOA expenses, though the exact amount is not defined.
Okay, perfect. Let's go over to the next section, which is now called community use. So question number 13. The following language exists with regard to golf cart usage. And it says in quotes, Board of Directors at its sole discretion can suspend or prohibit golf carts, close quote. Do you support removal of that language and allowing the Board of Directors to include golf cart usage guidance, such as prohibiting individuals under 16 from operating a golf cart on association property in the rules and regulations? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if you want to remove the board's broad power to completely ban golf carts and instead let them set specific usage rules, like age limits, through the rules and regulations depending on the response. If yes, golf carts likely stay allowed, but with adjustable rules. If no, the board keeps the ability to fully ban them. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board still has control, but shifts from all or nothing authority to more detailed rule setting. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It avoids extreme actions like full bans and allows more practical, targeted rules. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yes, the current documents allow full prohibition. This would replace that with guidance-based control. One potential downside is the board loses the ability to quickly eliminate golf carts entirely if issues arise. This may or may not be clearly written, mostly clear, but combines removal and replacement in one question. Financial impact, not direct, but could affect enforcement or liability over time.
And does this address anything to the effect of a street legal golf cart? So for example, a golf cart that had blinkers, lights, horn, that was able to have a license plate on it?
No, it doesn't address that at all. This question is purely about who controls the rules and how they're structured, not what qualifies as a legal golf cart. So things like street legal versus non-street legal, lights, blinkers, horn, registration or license plates, none of that is defined or even referenced here. What it does do is shift authority so the board could later decide to include those kinds of requirements in the rules and regulations. But as written, it doesn't establish any of them.
Perfect, thank you. Let's go to question number 14. Should golf carts be registered with the management company? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if all golf carts in the community should be officially registered with the HOA or management company, depending on the response. If yes, owners would likely need to submit information about their carts. If no, no formal tracking system is created. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains visibility and oversight of who owns and operates golf carts. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It helps with accountability, enforcement, and identifying owners if issues arise. Here's whether something like this already exists. Not specified. This would introduce a formal tracking process if approved. One potential downside is it adds administrative burden for both residents and management. This may or may not be clearly written. Clear, but doesn't define what registration requires. Financial impact, possible minor administrative cost, depending on how the system is implemented.
Thank you. Let's go on to question number 15. The governance documents currently state, and this is in quotes, no owner may actively engage in any solicitations for commercial purposes within Webb Bayview, close quote. Would you support changing that language to, quote, no solicitors of a commercial nature shall be allowed within Webb Bayview common property without the prior written consent of the board of directors, and such consent can be withdrawn with notice at the sole discretion of the board of directors, close quote. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if you want to change the rule from banning residents from soliciting to instead banning all commercial solicitors on common property unless the board gives permission depending on the response. If yes, solicitation could be allowed with board approval. If no, the current blanket restriction on owners stays. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board gains significant control to allow or deny commercial activity at its discretion. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It allows flexibility for approved vendors or events while still restricting unwanted solicitation. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yes, the current rule is stricter and applies specifically to owners. One potential downside is it centralizes power with the board and could lead to inconsistent approvals. This may or may not be clearly written, mostly clear but broad. Sole discretion gives very wide authority.
So realistically, a person, if they have a commercial business, they may or may not solicit based upon if the board approves and they deem if they like the business or not, or I'm confused here.
Yeah, you're reading that correctly. Under the current rule, residents can't solicit at all. It's a blanket restriction. Under the proposed change, it shifts to solicitation is allowed if the board approves it, and the board can approve or revoke that permission at any time. So in practice, yes, whether someone can promote a business would depend on board approval. That doesn't necessarily mean if they like the business, but it does mean the board decides what's appropriate. There's no fixed standard defined in the question. Decisions could vary case by case. So your confusion is valid. The rule introduces flexibility, but also subjectivity.
And one more follow-up question. So that means technically we could have two separate residents with legal business entities that are registered in the state of Florida. One may be rejected, one may be approved, even though they both went through all of the proper paperwork to have their businesses licensed in the state.
Yes, that's absolutely possible under how this is written. Because the key phrase is at the sole discretion of the board, approval isn't tied to whether a business is legally registered or compliant with state laws. So in practice, two residents could both have fully legitimate licensed businesses. One could be approved to solicit or operate in common areas. The other could be denied ad. The decision would come down to board judgment, not just legal status. That's the trade-off this question introduces. Flexibility for the board to allow certain activities, but also potential inconsistency, since there are no defined approval criteria in the language agreeers. So your interpretation is spot on. Legal compliance doesn't guarantee HOA approval under this structure.
Perfect, thank you. Let's go to question number 16. Would you support prohibiting any interest group or club from having a leader or officer who receives financial gain from the group's activity or purpose? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if club or group leaders should be banned from making money from the group's activities, depending on the response. If yes, leaders can't profit from clubs. If no, they may be allowed to earn money from organizing or running activities. Here's who gains control or flexibility. A yes limits individuals, a no allows more flexibility for organizers. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It aims to prevent conflicts of interest or people using clubs for personal profit. Here's whether something like this already exists. Not clearly defined. This would add a new restriction. One potential downside is it could discourage qualified or motivated people from leading groups. This may or may not be clearly written, clear in intent, but financial gain could vary in interpretation. Financial impact, indirect, may reduce paid or professional-led activities within the community.
If you were to rewrite this, what would be the best way to do so?
This one is directionally clear, but it's a bit too absolute and could block reasonable situations. The issue is that any financial gain is very broad. That could include things like a small stipend, cost reimbursement, or even a professional leading a class. A cleaner version would separate abuse versus reasonable compensation. Something like, no officer or leader of an interest group or club may receive undisclosed or disproportionate financial benefit from the group's activities. Any compensation must be disclosed to members and approved in accordance with HOA policies. This does a few things better: prevents hidden or exploitative profit, allows transparency and accountability, still permits reasonable, disclosed compensation. So instead of banning everything, it focuses on fairness and disclosure, which is usually the real intent behind a rule like this.
Perfect, thank you. Question number 17. Would you support adding language that states the use of HOA common property by residents to serve their private businesses shall be addressed as any other outside usage with respect to charges/fees, i.e. Driftwood Club rental agreement? Yes or no?
It's 1 o'clock.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if residents should have to pay fees to use HOA common areas for their personal businesses, just like any outside group would, depending on the response. If yes, residents running business activities in common spaces would be charged. If no, they may continue using those spaces without formal fees. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains control to standardize and enforce fees for business-related use. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's trying to prevent residents from using shared spaces for profit without paying, ensuring fairness. Here's whether something like this already exists. Rental agreements exist, like Driftwood, but this applies that model to resident-run businesses. One potential downside is it could discourage small-scale or casual resident-led activities. This may or may not be clearly written, mostly clear, but doesn't define what counts as serving a private business. Financial impact, yes, could generate revenue for the HOA and add costs for residents using spaces commercially.
Okay, perfect. Next question, number 18. The governance documents currently state, in quotes, no cooking shall be permitted, nor shall any goods or beverages be consumed on the common areas except in areas designated for the purposes by the association. The board shall have the right to prohibit or restrict the use of grills or barbecue facilities throughout Webb Bayview. Do you support removing this clause in totality and allowing the board to define the food and beverage usage on common area through the rules and regulations? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if you want to remove the strict rule about no cooking or eating in common areas, and instead let the board decide those rules through the rules and regulations, depending on the response. If yes, food and cooking rules become flexible and can change over time. If no, the current strict limitations stay in place. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board gains more control to allow or restrict food and cooking as they see fit. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It allows for more practical use of shared spaces, like events or gatherings. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yes, the current documents are more restrictive and fixed. One potential downside is less resident control and potential inconsistency depending on board decisions. This may or may not be clearly written, clear in intent, but removes a firm rule without specifying the replacement. Financial impact: indirect, could affect event usage, maintenance, or enforcement costs.
Okay, perfect. And number 19. As residents of Bayview frequently enjoy participating in games of chance, do you support the removal of the following section of the declaration? In quotes, no gambling or games of chance, including without limitation, bingo, casino games, raffles, 50-50 drawings, poker, mahjong, or any other games of chance or skill involving or requiring entry fees, betting or other forms of gambling shall be conducted in homes or in common areas within Webb Bayview, except in Section 1, in compliance with all state, local, and federal legal requirements. Section 2, with express written approval of the board, which can be withheld, denied, or conditioned in its sole discretion. And Section 3, in compliance with all rules and regulations regarding same adopted by the board. Whew, that was a mouthful. Sorry about that. Yes or no?
Yeah, that was a mouthful. But here's the clean breakdown. Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if you want to remove the current rule that heavily restricts gambling and games of chance, even though they're already allowed under strict conditions depending on the response. If yes, those restrictions are removed and the board could redefine or allow these activities more freely. If no, the current tightly controlled structure stays. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board gains more flexibility to allow or manage these activities without the detailed constraints in the declaration. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It simplifies a complex rule and aligns with how residents may already be informally participating. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yes, these activities are technically allowed now, but only under multiple conditions and approvals. One potential downside is removing the structure could lead to less oversight or more frequent gambling-related activities. This may or may not be clearly written. It's complex, but the intent is clear. Remove a detailed restriction.
Okay, perfect. We're going to switch over to the next section now, which is now called fitness. So question number 20. With respect to fitness programs within the association's common property, which of the following would you support? First one is A, lifestyle managed program contracting a professional fitness business utilizing fully certified instructors and providing the necessary liability coverage to shield the community from liability, open to all residents, offering the various training classes as provided by the residents with a nominal cost of $5 per class. Or the second option is individual trainers must be certified and will have to enter into a contract with the association that will require coverage and language to minimize liability with a charge for utilizing common property for financial gain and at a price set by the individual trainer. All transactions will be handled through the lifestyle program, and all trainers will receive their payments along with a 1099 at year end.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking how fitness programs should be run. either through one HOA managed program with low-cost classes, or allowing individual trainers to operate under HOA approved contracts depending on the response. The first option creates a centralized, standardized program. The second allows more variety with independent trainers setting their own pricing. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Option 1 gives more control to the HOA/lifestyle team. Option 2 allows more flexibility for trainers and residents. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's addressing liability, organization, and fairness in how fitness services use common spaces. Here's whether something like this already exists. Fitness use likely exists informally. This formalizes structure and oversight. One potential downside is Option 1 limits variety. Option 2 may lead to inconsistent pricing and quality. This may or may not be clearly written. Clear, but dense. Two very different models in one question.
Now, would there be a possibility of something like this to be basically allowing both models instead?
Yeah, that's a very reasonable thought, and honestly, a more flexible model. As written, the question forces an either-or choice, but in reality, these two models aren't mutually exclusive. You could absolutely structure it as a baseline HOA managed program, low cost, consistent classes, plus approved independent trainers operating under guidelines. That would give consistency and affordability from the HOA program, variety and specialization from independent trainers. The only catch is coordination. You'd need clear rules around scheduling, space usage, insurance, and payment handling so they don't conflict. So yes, what you're describing is not only possible, it's actually a more balanced approach.
And would there be any financial impact for having something like this?
Yeah, there definitely could be, on a few different levels. If you ran both models together, you'd likely see revenue potential from trainer fees, space usage, or program participation, administrative costs for managing schedules, contracts, and payments, insurance considerations, since more activity usually means more coverage or oversight. The HOA managed program, option 1, is more predictable, low cost, but also lower revenue. The independent trainer model, option 2, could generate more income, but also comes with more variability and management effort. So the net impact depends on how it's structured. It could be close to cost neutral, slightly revenue positive, or require small subsidies, depending on participation and pricing. Bottom line, not zero impact, but it can be designed to largely support itself if managed well.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to the next section, which is governance and financials. Question number 21. In the assessment section, do you support adding the requirement for, in quotes, the BOD will conduct a reserve study every 3 years and present the findings and recommendations to the residents? Close quote. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if the HOA should be required to perform a formal financial study of reserves every 3 years and share the results with residents depending on the response. If yes, regular reserve studies become mandatory. If no, they may still happen but not on a fixed schedule. Here's who gains control or flexibility. This increases transparency for residents and adds a structured obligation for the board. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It helps ensure long-term financial planning for things like repairs, replacements, and major expenses. Here's whether something like this already exists. Reserve studies may be done periodically, but this would formalize the timing and reporting. One potential downside is it adds cost and administrative effort on a recurring basis. This may or may not be clearly written, clear and straightforward.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And so question number 22. In the resale contribution section, it currently lists the amount paid to the association upon every resale as $1,000. Do you support increasing that value or leaving it unchanged? And there's 3 options: $1,000, $2,000, and $3,000.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking how much new buyers should pay to the HOA when a home is sold. Either keep it at $1,000 or increase it to $2,000 or $3,000, depending on the response. The selected amount becomes the new resale contribution fee paid at closing. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains more funding if increased. Buyers bear the cost at purchase. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It helps boost HOA reserves or offset costs tied to turnover and community upkeep. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yes, it currently exists at $1,000. This adjusts that amount. One potential downside is higher fees could make homes slightly less attractive to buyers. This may or may not be clearly written, very clear and easy to understand.
Perfect. Question number 23. Would you support an additional food and beverage card for the second half of 2026? And there's two options. Yes, if deemed necessary by the Board of Directors based on monthly Sailfish financials, allow the Board of Directors to determine the amount needed not to exceed $400 for another food and beverage card to support the restaurant financially for the remainder of the year, or the second option is no. I think I need to give you additional clarification for this one. As of 2026, this year we were required to spend $500 for the Sailfish card, but it had to be utilized by the end of June, and it was not valid for the entire year, whereas prior years it actually elapsed for the entire year.
Got it. That context helps a lot. Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if residents should potentially be required to buy a second food and beverage card, up to $400, for the second half of the year to help financially support the Sailfish restaurant depending on the response. If yes, the board can decide whether to issue another required spend. If no, there won't be an additional card. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board gains discretion to impose another required spend based on restaurant performance. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's trying to keep the restaurant financially viable if the first $500 program ending mid-year isn't enough. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yes, you already had a required $500 card for the first half of 2026. This extends that concept. One potential downside is residents could be required to spend more money without a guaranteed benefit or full-year usability. This may or may not be clearly written. It's somewhat complex. Ties spending to board discretion and financial performance. Financial impact, yes, potential additional required spend up to $400 per household.
Perfect, thank you. Let's go to question number 24. Would you support the establishment of a litigation reserve of $250,000 by way of increased HOA fees? And it says approximately $8 per month to be accumulated over 3 years to address legal actions brought by residents. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if you want to build a $250,000 fund to cover legal disputes, funded by about an 8-month increase over 3 years depending on the response. If yes, HOA fees increase to build this reserve. If no, legal costs would continue to be handled case by case. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains financial preparedness and flexibility to handle lawsuits. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It helps avoid sudden large assessments if legal issues arise. Here's whether something like this already exists. Not specified. This would create a dedicated legal reserve. One potential downside is residents pay more even if the funds are never fully used. This may or may not be clearly written. Clear and specific, including cost and timeline. Financial impact, yes, approximately 8-month increase for 3 years.
One follow-up question on this, though, in terms of the financials, would it be $8 per month in perpetuity, or just it has a finite period of time and it ends? Because what happens at the end of 3 years? Do we stop getting charged $8 or no?
Great question.
Can you respond back to that? I'm sorry, you heard the dog bark in the background.
All good, I heard it. No worries. So, just to restate it cleanly for the walkthrough, the question implies the $8 month is temporary because it's tied to reaching 250 CALR over 3 years, but it never explicitly says the charge stops. So residents are left with a bit of a gap. It could end once the reserve is funded, or it could remain part of the ongoing HOA dues unless the board later reduces it. That lack of clarity is the key point here.
Okay, thank you. Number 25, would you support the requirement for a resident to pay legal fees incurred by the HOA for any resident that brought a legal issue that was not resolved as requested by the resident in the legal letter received?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if a resident should have to pay the HOA's legal fees if they bring a legal complaint and don't get the outcome they were asking for, depending on the response. If yes, residents risk paying HOA legal costs if they lose or don't succeed. If no, the current approach to legal cost responsibility stays. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains protection from legal expenses. Residents take on more financial risk. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It aims to discourage frivolous or excessive legal actions against the HOA. Here's whether something like this already exists. Legal fee rules often exist, but this would make it more explicit and potentially broader. One potential downside is it could discourage residents from raising legitimate concerns due to fear of financial risk. This may or may not be clearly written. It's somewhat vague. Not resolved as requested could mean partial or unclear outcomes.
So can you expand upon that with the vague portion?
Yeah, this is one of the more important gray areas in the whole survey. The phrase "not resolved as requested" is doing a lot of work, and it's not clearly defined. Here's where the ambiguity comes in. First, it doesn't say what counts as success. If a resident asks for 5 things and only gets 3, is that resolved? If the HOA fixes the issue but not in the exact way requested, does that count? Second, it doesn't distinguish between outcomes: losing a lawsuit outright, settling, getting partial relief. All of those could technically be interpreted as not resolved as requested. Third, it doesn't define who decides. Is it a court judgment? The board's interpretation? The legal outcome itself? That's a big deal because it introduces uncertainty. So the real risk here is a resident could raise a legitimate issue, even partially win or improve the situation, and still potentially be on the hook for HOA legal fees, depending on how not resolved is interpreted. A clearer version would tie this to something objective, like if the resident does not prevail in a final legal judgment. That removes the gray area and ties cost responsibility to a clear outcome instead of interpretation.
And one more follow-up question. The way it's written currently, would that basically indicate that if all of a sudden there was a discussion between the resident and the board, that means legal fees could technically keep going up based upon the negotiation, and then the resident would still be responsible for repaying that?
Yeah, the way it's written, that risk is definitely there. Because it doesn't define when legal fees start counting, whether informal disputes versus formal legal action are included, or what the stopping point is. So in a worst-case interpretation, a dispute escalates. The HOA engages legal counsel over time. Fees accumulate during back and forth, negotiation, or escalation. And if the outcome isn't as requested, the resident could be responsible for those costs. So that's the concern. It's open-ended. A tighter version would usually limit this to formal legal proceedings, not general disputes, tie it to a final outcome, like losing in court, and sometimes even cap or define what's recoverable. As written, it leaves room for legal costs to build during the process, not just at the end, which is where the financial uncertainty comes in.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Now we go to the next section, which is called Lease/Rentals. Question number 26. Do you agree to adding this statement to the section on leasee use of amenities? Only lessees who have fully completed the leasing requirements to rent a home in the community shall have the right of access to and use of the community amenities on the same basis as the owner. The HOA management company must have the approved leasing agreement on file and have approved the rental application in order for the lease to be a valid lease. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. This is asking if renters should only be allowed to use community amenities if their lease and application have been fully approved and are on file with the HOA, depending on the response. If yes, unapproved or incomplete leases would result in no amenity access. If no, access may be less strictly tied to approval status. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains stronger control over lease compliance and amenity access. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It ensures all renters are properly vetted and documented before using shared facilities. Here's whether something like this already exists. Leasing requirements likely exist, but this ties them directly to amenity access. One potential downside is tenants could lose access due to administrative delays, even if the lease itself is valid. This may or may not be clearly written, mostly clear, but depends on how quickly approvals are processed. Financial impact, minimal direct impact, but could increase administrative workload.
And follow-up question to that. So you're saying increase administrative workload, but how would also the enforcement piece work?
Good question. This is where it moves from policy to operational reality. Enforcement would likely rely on a few mechanisms. First, verification systems. Amenity access, badges, fobs, wristbands would need to be tied to approved lease status. If someone isn't approved, their access would be denied or deactivated. Second, manual checks. Staff or monitors may need to confirm whether someone is an approved lessee. This could happen at places like the pool, gym, or events. Third, record tracking. Management has to maintain an up-to-date list of approved leases. Any delay in processing could directly impact access. Where it gets tricky. If approval is pending, is access denied immediately? How are guests versus unapproved tenants distinguished? What happens if someone uses amenities before paperwork is complete?
Okay, question number 27. Under the leases section, would you support updating the language to, quote, the rental lease agreement shall be in writing and must be provided to the association at least 14 days prior to the commencement of the term of the lease agreement for purposes of verifying that the lease agreement complies with the requirements of this section? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Any lease must be written and submitted to the HOA at least 14 days before it starts, so they can review it. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, leases must be submitted in advance for approval. If no, owners keep more flexibility on timing. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains more oversight. Owners lose some flexibility in how quickly they can rent. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It helps prevent non-compliant leases and tenants moving in without HOA review. Here's whether something like this already exists. Lease rules exist, but this adds a strict advance submission requirement. T could delay rentals or complicate last-minute agreements. This may or may not be clearly written, It's clear, but doesn't say what happens if the 14-day requirement isn't met. Financial impact. No direct cost, but timing delays could affect rental income.
Next question. Do you support adding this requirement to the leases section of the declaration? In quotes, need to identify all persons on the lease who will reside at the house/villa, so background checks paid for by the owner can be conducted on all occupants.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Everyone living in the home must be listed, and all occupants would go through a background check paid for by the owner. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, all occupants must be disclosed and approved. If no, fewer or no background checks may apply. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains more control over who lives in the community. Owners take on more responsibility and cost. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's meant to prevent unknown occupants and improve safety and accountability. Here's whether something like this already exists. Not explicitly for all occupants with required background checks, privacy concerns, and added time cost for owners and tenants. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear overall, but doesn't define what happens if someone fails a check.
Okay, perfect. Let's see. Next question. Question number 29. Do you support the following addition to the leases section? Homes may not be leased until after 2 years of ownership. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. You can't rent out your home until you've owned it for at least 2 years. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, new owners must wait 2 years before leasing. If no, they can rent sooner. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains more control over rentals. Owners lose flexibility. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's aimed at discouraging investors and keeping the community more owner-occupied. Here's whether something like this already exists. Not in this specific 2-year form. T can create issues for owners who need to rent due to life changes. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear, but doesn't mention exceptions like hardship or relocation. Financial impact. Indirect, could affect resale demand and rental income flexibility.
Okay, question number 30. Do you support the following addition to the leases section? Add appropriate legal language that prevents Section 8, corporate entities, and LLCs from purchasing and leasing property in Webb Bayview. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It would restrict certain buyers, like Section 8 participants, companies, or LLCs, from buying homes to rent them out. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, those groups could be blocked from purchasing and leasing. If no, they remain allowed. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains more control over who can own and rent. The buyer pool becomes more limited. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's aimed at reducing investor ownership and keeping the community more owner-occupied. Here's whether something like this already exists. General leasing rules may exist, but this is a more explicit and targeted restriction. T could raise legal concerns depending on how it's written, especially around Section 8. This may or may not be clearly written. Appropriate legal language is vague and leaves details undefined. Financial impact. Indirect, could affect home values by narrowing the pool of buyers and may involve legal costs to draft and defend the language.
So you said legal fees. I heard you mention something about that. Are you talking in terms of the costs for an attorney to actually write this particular section in a way that is protecting the HOA? Or are you talking about us potentially being sued because of language in the documents? I'm confused here.
It's actually both, but they happen at different stages. First, up front, yes, you'd almost certainly need an attorney to carefully draft this language. This isn't something an HOA can safely write casually, so there would be legal fees to create it properly. Then second, potential downstream risk. Depending on how it's written and enforced, there could be legal challenges. That doesn't mean it will happen, but it introduces some level of exposure, which could lead to additional legal costs. So, simply put, there's a known cost to draft it and a possible cost if it's ever challenged.
But there's no defined cost to draft it, correct?
Correct. There's no defined cost in the survey itself. The question doesn't specify how much legal drafting would cost, whether it's already budgeted, or if existing counsel would handle it within current fees. So any legal cost is implied, not stated. In practice, it could range from minimal if it's a small amendment handled by existing counsel to more involved if it requires careful fair housing review and revisions.
Okay, thank you. Next question, 31. Do you support the following addition to the leases section? Add a statement that any violations of any part of this section will result in the lease to be null and void. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. If any leasing rule is broken, the lease could be canceled entirely. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, violations could result in the lease being terminated. If no, enforcement would likely stay with fines or other penalties. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains strong enforcement power. Owners and tenants lose protection and flexibility. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's meant to ensure strict compliance with leasing rules. Here's whether something like this already exists. Enforcement exists, but this adds a much stronger consequence, voiding the lease. T may be overly harsh, especially for minor violations. This may or may not be clearly written. It's broad and doesn't define what level of violation triggers termination.
Okay, next question, number 32. Do you support the following addition to the leases section? Add a section that if the police are called to a leased home for nuisance violations that are proven on more than one occasion, that the board of directors may cancel the lease with 30-day notice.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. If a rental home has repeated confirmed nuisance issues that involve police calls, the HOA could cancel the lease with 30 days notice. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, repeated problems could lead to lease termination. If no, enforcement likely stays with warnings, fines, or other actions. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains stronger control over tenant behavior. Owners have less protection over keeping tenants in place. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's aimed at stopping disruptive or repeat nuisance situations more quickly. Here's whether something like this already exists. General nuisance rules may exist, but this adds a direct lease cancellation mechanism. Winners could lose tenants due to behavior they don't fully control. This may or may not be clearly written. Proven nuisance and what qualifies as an incident aren't clearly defined. Financial impact, yes. Potential loss of rental income if leases are terminated early.
Okay, we're moving on to the next section, which is now tagged as Other. Question number 33. Do you agree with making the following change? Under the minor's use of commonly shared facilities, remove this section entirely as minor children are not allowed to live here. Owners are responsible for all guests, including minors, as per the declarant documents. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It removes the specific rules about minors using shared facilities and instead relies on the general rule that owners are responsible for all guests, including visiting children. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, the minors section is deleted. If no, those specific rules remain in place. Here's who gains control or flexibility. This simplifies the rules and shifts responsibility more onto homeowners rather than detailed HOA restrictions. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's likely cleaning up outdated or redundant language, since minors aren't allowed to live in the community. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yes. Restrictions on minors living there and owner responsibility for guests already exist. T could create less clarity about what visiting minors are allowed to do. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear, but assumes general guest rules fully cover minors.
So would there need to be a review of other rules to validate that removing this is going to negatively or positively impact the rules?
Yes, practically speaking, there should be. When you remove a section like this, you're not just deleting words. You're relying on other parts of the documents to fully cover the gap. So what would ideally happen is a review of guest rules, a review of amenity usage rules, and confirmation that minors are still clearly governed under those individuos. If that review isn't done, the risk is you end up with gray areas where enforcement becomes inconsistent or people interpret the rules differently. So the intent here is simplification, but it really depends on whether the remaining rules are strong and clear enough on their own.
Okay, let's go to the next question. Number 34. The current drones section permits unrestricted drone use on association common property. Would you support restricting recreational drone use within Webb Bayview, except for storm damage evaluation as otherwise permitted? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Right now, drones can be used freely, and this would limit or ban recreational use, only allowing things like storm inspections. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, casual drone flying would be restricted. If no, current unrestricted use continues. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains more control. Residents lose flexibility to use drones recreationally. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's likely addressing privacy, safety, and nuisance concerns from drones flying near homes. Here's whether something like this already exists. Current rules allow unrestricted use, so this would be a shift toward restriction. And T may frustrate residents who use drones as a hobby. This may or may not be clearly written. It's fairly clear, but doesn't define what counts as recreational versus permitted use.
Did you say something about liability also in there?
Yeah, good catch. I did allude to that earlier, so let me tighten it up. The liability angle comes from risk exposure, not FAA compliance. If drones are unrestricted, there's higher chance of property damage, hitting a home, car, person, privacy complaints, flying near windows, or even injury claims. Even if the operator is technically at fault, the HOA can still get pulled into disputes because it's happening on common property or within the community. So, by restricting recreational drone use, the HOA is essentially trying to reduce the number of potential incidents, limit complaints and conflicts, and lower the chance of being involved in a claim or dispute. It's not that liability goes away, but it becomes more controlled.
But if the FAA requires registration of drones, then we know the exact person that is responsible for that drone. Therefore, the liability is not on the HOA. Am I incorrect in saying this?
You're partially right, but not fully protected the way it sounds. Yes, FAA registration helps identify the operator. So in a direct incident, the primary liability would likely fall on the drone operator. But here's where it gets nuanced. Even if the operator is known, the HOA can still get pulled in because the activity is happening within the community environment. Potential claims could argue the HOA allowed or failed to restrict a known risk, especially if incidents become repeated or predictable. Think of it less like who caused it and more like who had control over the environment where it happened. A simple analogy: if someone trips on a clearly dangerous condition in a shared space, even if they contributed to it, the HOA can still be involved because it oversees the area. So FAA registration helps with accountability, but it doesn't fully eliminate exposure or involvement for the HOA.
Can I play devil's advocate on this? Would that be able to be the same to be said for golf carts, seeing that the HOA would allow golf carts in the community, and if somebody was hit with a golf cart, the HOA can be involved because they're allowing that too?
Yeah, that's actually a really good comparison, and you're thinking about it the right way. Short answer, yes, the same concept can apply to golf carts. If the HOA allows an activity, whether it's golf carts, drones, or anything else, there's always a possibility they could be named or pulled into a claim, especially if someone argues the rules were too loose, enforcement was lacking, or a known risk wasn't addressed. But here's the key difference. Golf carts are typically expected, common, and visibly regulated, speed rules, age limits, paths, etc., operating on the ground in more predictable ways. Drones are less predictable, airspace, visibility, control loss, more tied to privacy concerns, and historically newer, so rules are often less mature. So your logic holds, HOA exposure isn't unique to drones, but the risk profile is different, which is why boards sometimes choose to be stricter with drones than something like golf carts.
Okay, let's go to the next question. We are at the halfway mark finally. Let's see here. We are now at question number 35. Would you support the need for board approval for any block party that requests a street closure in an effort to identify an emergency egress issues? Any emergency egress issues, yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. If you want to close a street for a block party, you'd need HOA board approval first. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, street closures must be reviewed and approved. If no, residents may have more freedom to organize without formal approval. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains control over street access. Residents lose some flexibility. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's focused on safety, making sure emergency vehicles can still get through and access isn't blocked. Here's whether something like this already exists. General rules likely exist, but this adds a specific approval requirement for closures. T could slow down or discourage spontaneous neighborhood events. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear, but doesn't define approval timelines or criteria.
Okay, perfect. Let's go to question number 36. Current rules require all guests utilizing the gym equipment to be accompanied by a resident. Would you support eliminating this requirement and increasing our liability insurance to cover the increased risk of litigation in the event of an injury? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Guests can currently only use the gym if a resident is with them. This would remove that rule, but increase insurance to cover the added risk. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, guests can use the gym alone and insurance costs go up. If no, the current supervision rule stays. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Guests and residents gain convenience. The HOA manages risk through insurance instead of supervision. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about making the gym easier to access for guests without requiring a resident present. Here's whether something like this already exists. The current rule requires resident accompaniment, so this is a direct change. Higher risk of misuse or injury without supervision. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear, but doesn't specify the exact cost or coverage increase. Financial impact, yes, likely higher HOA fees to cover increased liability insurance.
And this is specifically calling the gym. Does the same rules apply to things like pickleball courts or tennis courts, or the pool, for example, or no?
Good question, and the answer is no, not automatically. Here's the key distinction. This question is very specifically written for the gym. So, the current rule about requiring a resident to accompany guests applies to gym equipment. This proposed change only removes that requirement for the gym. It does not automatically apply to pickleball courts, tennis courts, the pool, or other amenities. Each of those can have separate rules. Now, practically speaking, sometimes communities use the gym as a test case. If this passes and works well, similar changes could be proposed later for other amenities, but that would require separate rules or votes. So as written, this is targeted, not universal.
Okay, let's go to the next question, number 37. Currently, a number of residences have more than 2 residents recorded in the system, and all residents have unfettered access to all amenities. There has been a concern raised that some residents list their, in parentheses, age 19 and over, adult children as residents when they do not reside in Bayview. Would you support a yearly charge for all listed residents above 2 unless this includes a verified health condition or an elderly parent? There's 3 options here. First option is no. Second option is yes at $250 a year. And the third option is yes at $400 per year.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. If a home lists more than 2 residents, they may have to pay a yearly fee per extra person, unless there's a valid reason like a health condition or elderly parent. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, extra listed residents beyond 2 trigger a yearly fee, $250 or $400. If no, no additional charges apply. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains more control over how residents are listed. Homeowners face more accountability and potential cost. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's trying to stop people from listing non-residents just to give them access to amenities. Here's whether something like this already exists. Access rules exist, but this introduces a financial enforcement mechanism. T could impact legitimate households or feel punitive in some cases. This may or may not be clearly written. It's fairly clear, but verification and enforcement details aren't defined. Financial impact, yes, $250 or $400 annually per additional listed resident.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the next question, number 38. Would you support adding management staff to have coverage until 9 p.m. when the amenity center closes at a cost of about $10 per residence per month or $120 per year increased assessment fee, yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Extend staff hours so someone is on site at the amenity center until 9 p.m. and increase HOA fees to pay for it. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, you get extended staff coverage and higher fees. If no, current staffing levels remain. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain more support and oversight in the evenings. The HOA takes on higher operating costs. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's likely about security, enforcement, and resident support during later hours when the facility is still open. Here's whether something like this already exists. Staff coverage exists, but this extends it to match closing hours. Higher monthly costs for all residents, regardless of usage. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear and transparent. It even states the estimated cost.
So the estimated cost is $10 per month or $120 per year for 950 homes. What would be the cost per hour for, I think our amenity center currently closes at 6. It may close at 5. I'd have to verify those hours. But doing that math, what would be the average cost per hour to actually extend that coverage?
Good question. Let's ballpark it. First, total annual cost, 950 homes, because 120 per year equals $114,000 per year. Now for hours, if the center currently closes at 6 p.m. and extends to 9 p.m., that's 3 extra hours per day, 3 hours, 365 days, 1,095 hours per year. So, 114,000 to 1,095, $104 per hour. Now, if it actually closes at 5 p.m., so 4 extra hours, 4 times 365 equals 1,460 hours. $114,000, 1,460 to $78 per hour. So realistically, you're looking at roughly $80 to $105 per hour for extended coverage, depending on actual hours. That would include wages, overhead, and management costs, not just a single staff salary.
So basically, it's $114,000 per year to increase the hours till 9 p.m., roughly.
Yes, that's a fair way to summarize it. Based on the numbers provided, stalls to $120 per home, CAMs to 950 homes, $114,000 per year total. So effectively, the community as a whole would be funding about $114K annually to extend staffing coverage until 9 p.m.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Let's see. Question number 39. Do you support the use of liability waivers for all residents/guests to use any/all of the amenities? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Anyone using the amenities, residents or guests, would have to sign a waiver acknowledging risk before using them. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, waivers become required for amenity use. If no, current access continues without that requirement. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains legal protection. Residents and guests take on more responsibility and may face extra steps to access amenities. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's aimed at reducing liability and protecting the HOA from injury-related claims. Here's whether something like this already exists. Some amenities may have waivers, but this would apply it broadly to all. T can create friction, more paperwork, tracking, and enforcement challenges. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear in intent, but doesn't explain how waivers are managed or enforced. Financial impact, minimal direct cost, but potential admin overhead for managing waivers.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the next section. We're now into the section called parking. Question number 40, parking. Do you support changing the parking language to the following? In quotes, all parking within the property shall be in accordance with the rules and regulations adopted from time to time by the board. Close quote. Since rules and regulations are the sole responsibility of the board, this change will enable the parking rules to be updated easily as the community assesses the rule over time, without the need for the entire community to again vote to change the governance documents. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Instead of parking rules being fixed in the main documents, the board could change them over time through rules and regulations without a community vote. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, parking rules can be updated more easily by the board. If no, changes would continue to require a broader community vote. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board gains significant control and flexibility. Residents have less direct say in future changes. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about making parking rules easier to adjust as needs change over time. Here's whether something like this already exists. Some flexibility may exist, but this formalizes shifting control to the board. Residents could see rules change without direct voting input. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear and even explains the intent directly.
Okay, next question, number 41. Which parking rule would you prefer? Keep the existing rule, no street parking at any time. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It's asking if you want to keep the current rule that no street parking is allowed at any time. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, the strict no street parking rule stays. If no, you move to alternative parking options in the next question. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Keeping it limits resident and guest flexibility. Removing it allows more parking options. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about keeping streets clear for safety, appearance, and emergency access. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yes, this is the current rule being referenced. T can be inconvenient for guests or households with multiple vehicles. This may or may not be clearly written. Very clear. Simple yes or no on keeping the rule. Financial impact, none directly.
Okay, so question number 42, it says, if you responded yes to question 41, which is the one I just asked you, please skip to question 43. If you answered no, please complete the next item in this question. Allow service vehicles to park in the street and guests may park in the street if no further room is available in the driveway or garage. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. If you don't want the strict no street parking rule, this option would allow guests and service vehicles to park on the street, but only if the driveway and garage are full. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, limited street parking is allowed under conditions. If no, street parking remains restricted even if space is tight. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents and guests gain flexibility. The HOA gives up some control over strict parking enforcement. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's addressing overflow parking, especially for guests
It's 3
or
o'clock.
service workers. Here's whether something like this already exists. No, this is an alternative to the current strict no parking rule. T could lead to cluttered streets or make navigation tighter. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear, but enforcement, how you prove driveway is full, isn't defined.
Okay, so next question is number 43. If you responded yes to question 41 above, which was the one about keeping the no street parking at any time, please answer this question. I support allowing guest/service vehicles to park on one side of the street only to allow emergency vehicles ease of passage. The designated side would be alternated in a manner agreed by the community. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Even if you keep the no street parking rule, this would allow guests and service vehicles to park on one side of the street only, with the side rotating based on a community-agreed system. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, you keep strict parking but allow controlled one-sided exceptions. If no, the full no street parking rule stays with no exceptions. Here's who gains control or flexibility. This is a middle ground. HOA keeps control, but residents get limited flexibility. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It balances guest parking needs with emergency vehicle access. Here's whether something like this already exists. No, this is a conditional exception layered on top of the strict rule. T could be confusing to manage or enforce, especially with alternating sides. This may or may not be clearly written. Intent is clear, but how the alternating system works isn't defined.
Okay, question number 44. My apologies. 44. Would you support adding the following to the rules and regulations? In quotes, allow a limited number of oversized vehicle parking overnight, and it's in parentheses, 9 p.m. to 8 a.m. at the amenity center, after registering the vehicle and receiving a placard from management company. Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It would allow a limited number of oversized vehicles, like RVs or large trucks, to park overnight at the amenity center, but only if they're registered and have a placard. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, controlled overnight parking is allowed. If no, current restrictions on oversized vehicles remain. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain flexibility for temporary parking, The HOA maintains control through registration and limits. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's addressing situations where residents need short-term parking for large vehicles, travel, moving, etc. Here's whether something like this already exists. Temporary RV parking exists in limited form, but this expands and formalizes overnight use. It would create congestion or aesthetic concerns around the amenity center. This may or may not be clearly written. It's fairly clear, but limited number isn't defined. Financial impact, not directly stated, but could involve minor admin or permit handling costs.
Okay, so next question, number 45. Current RV parking rules allow for 24-hour parking to facilitate loading and unloading. Which of the following durations do you support? And this says, note, in all cases, the RV is not permitted to be used for living quarters. And there's 3 options, 24 hours, 48 hours, and 72 hours.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Right now, RVs can only be parked for 24 hours to load or unload. This is asking if you want to extend that time to 48 or 72 hours. Here's what happens depending on the response. If you choose a longer duration, residents get more time for prep or travel. If you keep 24 hours, the current limit stays. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain more flexibility with longer durations. The HOA maintains limits either way. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's addressing situations where 24 hours isn't enough for loading, unloading, or trip prep. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yes, 24-hour temporary parking is already allowed. Longer durations could lead to more visible RV presence or space usage concerns. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear and straightforward.
Okay, let's go to the next section, which is listed as the pool. So question number 46. The current pool hours are 30 minutes after sunrise until 30 minutes prior to sunset. This rule makes it difficult on residents to identify the actual times of operation. Would you support having fixed hours of operation for the daylight savings portion of the year and the non-daylight savings portion of the year, i.e., 7:30 to 7:30 for daylight savings time and 7:30 to 6:30 for the remainder of the year? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Instead of pool hours changing every day based on sunrise and sunset, this would set fixed, predictable hours depending on the time of year. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, the pool has consistent hours, like 7:30 to 7:30 or 7:30 to 6:30. If no, it continues to shift daily with daylight. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain clarity and consistency. The HOA simplifies communication and enforcement. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It removes confusion. People don't have to check sunrise-sunset times to know when the pool is open. Here's whether something like this already exists. Current rules use sunrise-sunset, so this replaces that with fixed hours. Fixed hours may not perfectly match actual daylight at certain times of year. This may or may not be clearly written. Very clear with examples provided.
Question, because I think there may be county and or state regulations around pool usage based upon adequate lighting or not having adequate lighting, is if this went into effect, could this potentially violate those rules?
That's a really sharp question. And yes, that is a valid consideration. Short answer, it could, depending on how the lighting is set up. Here's the nuance. Most counties and states, including Florida, have rules around adequate lighting for nighttime pool use, safety visibility requirements, sometimes life-saving equipment visibility. So if the pool is properly lit and meets code, fixed hours extending past sunset are usually fine. Not adequately lit, allowing use after dark could be a compliance issue. Right now, the sunrise-sunset rule is actually a simple way to stay automatically compliant without worrying about lighting standards. Switching to fixed hours means The HOA needs to ensure lighting meets requirements year-round. Otherwise, there could be safety or regulatory exposure. So the gap in the question is, it assumes fixed hours are fine, but doesn't address whether the facility is equipped to support that safely and legally. If it's not yes, it's not necessarily a problem, but it does depend on the infrastructure.
But if there's no lighting and they change the hours and it technically falls outside of the alignment with the county or the state with the rules that are set based on sunrise or sunset, we could be in violation of that and introduce legal liability.
You're thinking about this the right way, but let me tighten it so it's precise. It's not automatically a violation just because it's after sunset. The real trigger is whether the pool meets required lighting and safety standards for night use. So, if there's no adequate lighting and they allow use after dark, yes, that could create compliance and liability risk. If there is proper lighting that meets code, operating after sunset is typically allowed. The current sunrise-sunset rule is basically a built-in safety default. It avoids needing to prove lighting compliance. So your core point is valid, just slightly refined. The risk isn't the time itself. It's whether the facility is equipped to safely support that time. And you're also right on the second part. If they extend hours without meeting those requirements, it could introduce safety concerns, potential regulatory issues, and increased liability exposure. The survey question doesn't address that dependency at all. That's the gap.
Okay, perfect. Let's go to the next question. Number 47. To remove confusion, would you prefer to have children's hours at the pool the same 7 days per week? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It's asking if children's pool hours should be the same every day of the week instead of varying. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, children's hours become consistent across all 7 days. If no, they may continue to vary by day. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain predictability. The HOA simplifies scheduling and enforcement. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about reducing confusion so people don't have to remember different hours for different days. Here's whether something like this already exists. Children's hours exist, but may currently vary, which this aims to standardize. Flexibility to adjust hours for weekends or special usage patterns. This may or may not be clearly written, very clear and straightforward.
If you answered yes, this is question number 48, my apologies. If you answered yes to question 47 above, which hours would you prefer? There's 3 options: 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., or 2 p.m. to 5 p.m.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. If children's hours are the same every day, this asks which specific time block you prefer. Here's what happens depending on the response. Whichever time gets chosen becomes the standard daily window for children's pool access. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents collectively decide the schedule. The HOA enforces the selected time. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about standardizing and simplifying when children can use the pool. Here's whether something like this already exists. Children's hours exist, but this defines a fixed, consistent time block. Need time slot may not work well for everyone's schedule. This may or may not be clearly written, very clear with defined options.
Okay, question number 49. Would you support extended children's hours in the pool during certain holidays to facilitate family experiences? 3 options are no. Second option is yes, by expanding from 3 to 4 hours, and third option is yes, by expanding from 3 to 5 hours.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. On certain holidays, this would allow longer time windows for children to use the pool than the normal daily limit. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, children's hours are extended on holidays, either by 1 or 2 extra hours. If no, standard hours stay the same even on holidays. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Families gain more flexibility during holidays. The HOA adjusts rules for special occasions. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's aimed at supporting family visits and gatherings during holidays when more guests are present. Here's whether something like this already exists. Children's hours exist, but this adds a holiday-specific exception. Longer children's hours could reduce adult-only time during busy holidays. This may or may not be clearly written. Clear, but doesn't define which holidays apply.
Okay, question number 50. Would you support the elimination of children's hour restrictions in the pool? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It would completely remove the set time window for children, meaning children could use the pool at any time. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, there are no more restricted children's hours. If no, the current time limits stay in place. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Families gain full flexibility. Adults lose designated quiet or adult-focused time. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about simplicity and removing scheduling restrictions, especially for families. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yes, children's hours currently exist, so this would eliminate them. OKT could reduce the ability to have quieter, adult-oriented pool time. This may or may not be clearly written. Very clear. Full removal of the restriction.
Okay, next question, number 51. Currently, you can only have water at the side of the pool. Would you expand that to include all covered allowable drinks? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Right now, only water is allowed near the pool. This would allow other drinks too, as long as they're in approved covered containers. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, residents can bring more types of drinks poolside. If no, it stays water only. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain more flexibility. The HOA loosens restrictions, but still keeps some control through covered allowable rules. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about convenience and improving the pool experience. Here's whether something like this already exists. Water only is the current rule, so this would expand it. Higher risk of spills, mess, or prohibited items slipping through. This may or may not be clearly written, mostly clear, but allowable and covered aren't fully defined.
Okay, let's go to the next question, number 52. Currently, no drinks are allowed in the pool at any time. Would you modify that rule to allow all permissible drinks in solid tumbler-type containers with covers? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Right now, no drinks are allowed in the pool at all. This would allow drinks in the water, as long as they're in solid covered containers. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, people can bring drinks into the pool under those conditions. If no, the current no drinks in the pool rule stays. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain more flexibility. The HOA relaxes restrictions but still sets container rules. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about convenience and improving the pool experience. Here's whether something like this already exists. No. Current rules prohibit drinks in the pool entirely. Higher risk of spills, contamination, or cleanup issues in the water. This may or may not be clearly written, mostly clear, but permissible drinks isn't fully defined.
Okay, question number 53. Would you support coolers sized to hold the permissible drinks and snacks? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It would allow people to bring coolers to the pool area to hold drinks and snacks within whatever rules are allowed. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, coolers are permitted. If no, they remain restricted or not allowed. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain convenience. The HOA loosens restrictions, but still controls what's allowed inside the cooler. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about making it easier for residents and guests to bring food and drinks to the pool. Here's whether something like this already exists. Coolers are not clearly permitted today, so this would expand usage. It would lead to clutter, larger groups, or increased cleanup needs. This may or may not be clearly written. It's simple, but doesn't define size limits or enforcement.
Okay, so let's go to question number 54. Would you like to see Sailfish wait staff take orders and deliver on the pool deck? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It's asking if you want the on-site restaurant, Sailfish, staff to take orders and deliver food and drinks directly to the pool deck. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, you get poolside service. If no, you'd continue ordering separately and picking up yourself. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain convenience and a more resort-style experience. Operations become more complex for staff. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about improving the amenity experience and making the pool area more social and service-oriented. Here's whether something like this already exists. Not currently. This would be an added service. It would increase costs, staffing needs, or impact restaurant operations. This may or may not be clearly written, very clear in intent. Financial impact, not stated, but likely indirect costs, staffing, service model changes.
So this could potentially affect the amount of staff at the restaurant and or the amount of profits or loss that the restaurant is incurring based upon the population of the pool and or experiences inside the restaurant because staff are outside of the pool.
Yeah, you're thinking about the right trade-offs. It's not guaranteed to be negative, but yes, it could impact staffing and financial performance in a few ways. On one hand, poolside service could increase revenue, more people ordering because it's convenient, higher volume during peak pool times, potentially better overall experience. On the other hand, it could create operational strain, staff split between inside restaurant and pool deck, slower service inside if staffing isn't increased, need for additional hires or shifts. So the real impact depends on execution. If staffing is adjusted properly, could be a net positive. If not, could hurt service quality or margins. The key gap in the question is it doesn't address staffing model changes, cost of added service, or how revenue versus labor balance would work. So your instinct is right. This is less about yes, no service, and more about how well it's implemented operationally.
Okay, question number 55. Would you support the hiring of pool monitors to verify access to the pool to ensure guests are signed in, waivers are executed, and wristbands are distributed? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Hire staff, pool monitors, to check who's entering the pool, make sure guests are signed in, waivers are completed, and wristbands are given out. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, there's active monitoring and controlled access. If no, access remains more self-managed. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains much tighter control and enforcement. Residents and guests have less frictionless access. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about preventing unauthorized use, improving safety, and ensuring rules like waivers are followed. Here's whether something like this already exists. Monitoring may be limited today, so this would increase enforcement. T could feel restrictive or less relaxed, and may slow entry. This may or may not be clearly written. Clear in intent, but doesn't specify hours, staffing levels, or cost. Financial impact, likely yes, added staffing costs, though not specified here.
And potentially not addressing the different ingress points to the pool between the club and the two external exits coming in, or the two external entrances going into the pool.
Yeah, that's a really sharp catch, and you're pointing at a real gap. What the question assumes is there's a single, controllable entry point where a monitor can check people in. But in reality, if there are multiple access points, like the main club entrance plus 2 external pool entrances, then enforcement becomes much more complicated. So what happens is, a single monitor at one entrance, easy to bypass. Multiple entrances would require multiple monitors or restricted access points, which leads to a few implications. Either you increase staffing costs significantly, or you reconfigure access, lock gates, funnel entry through one point, or enforcement becomes inconsistent. So you're exactly right. The question focuses on what to do, pool monitors, but doesn't address how it actually works, given the physical layout. That's a pretty important operational gap.
Okay, next question is number 56. Would you be willing to increase the pool budget by $6 per month per residence to allow for heating the pool to 84 degrees all year to accommodate unforeseen colder weather? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Increase HOA fees to keep the pool heated to 84 degrees all year, even during colder weather. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, the pool stays consistently warm year-round and fees go up. If no, heating remains limited or seasonal. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain comfort and usability. The HOA takes on higher operating cost. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about making the pool usable during colder months and avoiding temperature drops. Here's whether something like this already exists. Heating likely exists, but not at a consistent year-round target like this. Higher ongoing cost for all residents, regardless of usage. This may or may not be clearly written. Very clear. It even states the monthly increase. Financial impact, yes, about $6 a month or $72 a year per residence.
But unfortunately, there's no analysis to say if we brought it down to 83 degrees, if it would be adequate or not to accommodate for that cost.
Exactly. That's the missing analysis. The question gives one option, 84 degrees for $6 a month per residence. But it does not compare alternatives like 83 degrees, 82 degrees, seasonal heating, colder month-only heating, or heating only during high-use periods. So residents are being asked to approve a cost increase without knowing whether a lower target temperature might solve most of the problem for less money. A clearer version would show something like 84 degrees equals estimated cost, 83 degrees equals estimated cost, 82 degrees estimated cost, seasonal only equals estimated cost. So the concern is valid. The question identifies a comfort goal, but it doesn't provide enough cost-benefit comparison to know if 84 degrees is the most efficient target.
Okay, next section is called property / Okay, the next section is called property / ARC. Question number 57. Do you support updating the hurricane shutters section of the declaration to be retitled, in quotes, temporary hurricane shutters increasing the allowable times to 1 week prior to the expected arrival of a storm and remove 1 week after the end of the hurricane watch or warning, and removing the need to match color and trim of the home? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It would treat shutters as temporary, allow them to go up earlier and stay up longer around storms, and remove the requirement to match the home's color. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, residents get more flexibility on timing and appearance. If no, current stricter timing and aesthetic rules stay. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain flexibility. The HOA reduces control over appearance and timing. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about practicality, giving people more time to prepare and recover from storms. Here's whether something like this already exists. Shutter rules exist, but this expands timing and relaxes aesthetic requirements. Hutters could stay up longer and create a less uniform look in the community. This may or may not be clearly written, mostly clear, but timing tied to expected arrival and end of watch warning could vary.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to next section. Next question is number 58. In the section dealing with landscaping, the current language reads, the association may, in its sole discretion, replace or plant additional plants, shrubs, or trees within the portions of the lots or common areas of Webb Bayview for which the association is responsible for landscape maintenance under this declaration. In quotes, do you support adding the following sentence at the end of this section? If the association's approved budget includes funds to replace plants and trees, this will only be accomplished in the order in which the tickets were submitted up to the amount authorized in the year's operating budget. And the question is yes or no.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. If landscaping replacements are budgeted, they would be done in the order requests, tickets are submitted, until the yearly budget runs out. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, there's a first-come, first-served system. If no, the HOA keeps full discretion on what gets done and when. Here's who gains control or flexibility. This reduces HOA discretion and adds a structured, resident-driven order of work. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about fairness and transparency, making sure requests are handled in a predictable order. Here's whether something like this already exists. Currently, the HOA has broad discretion without a required order. Urgent or higher need issues might get delayed behind earlier, less critical requests. This may or may not be clearly written, clear, but doesn't address exceptions for priority or safety issues. Financial impact, no new cost, just changes how existing budget is allocated.
Okay, so the next question is number 59. In the signs and flags section, do you agree with adding the following, in quotes, one sign reflecting the resident's preferred landscaper action will be allowed per flower bed and must be placed within an existing flower bed? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Residents would be allowed to place one sign per flower bed, indicating their preferred landscaping action, for example, instructions or requests, and it must stay within that flower bed. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, residents can use signage to communicate landscaping preferences. If no, signage remains restricted or not allowed. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain a voice in how their landscaping is handled. The HOA gives up some control over uniform appearance. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about improving communication between residents and landscaping crews. Here's whether something like this already exists. Sign and flag rules exist, but this adds a specific exception for landscaping signs. T could lead to visual clutter or inconsistent appearance across the community. This may or may not be clearly written, mostly clear, but preferred landscaper action isn't formally defined. Financial impact, none directly.
Okay, next question is number 60. Would you support allowing each residence to display one sports team or school flag as well as the already authorized American flag? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. In addition to the American flag, each home could display one sports team or school flag. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, residents can display one additional flag. If no, only currently allowed flags remain. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain more personal expression. The HOA slightly relaxes aesthetic control. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about allowing more personalization while still keeping limits. Here's whether something like this already exists. Flag rules exist, but this would expand what's permitted. It would lead to less uniform appearance across the community. This may or may not be clearly written, clear, but doesn't define size, placement, or condition standards.
And already authorized American flag, I thought it was a legal requirement that HOAs could not restrict the American flag. And additionally, what about the state of Florida flag, for example, or any other flags for that matter? Do they include or exclude that in this question, which clearly doesn't show right now?
You're right to question that. There's some important nuance here. On the American flag, yes, under federal law, the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act, HOAs generally cannot prohibit the display of the U.S. flag, as long as it's done in a reasonable way. Size, placement, safety, etc. So that part isn't really optional, that's already protected. Now on other flags, that's where HOAs do have more control. The Florida state flag is often treated similarly to the U.S. flag in many communities, but it's not automatically protected in the same way federally. Some states have additional protections, but HOAs can still regulate things like number, size, and placement. Now tying it back to this question, you're catching a real gap. The question only says one sports team or school flag, as well as the already authorized American flag. It does not clarify whether state flags, like Florida, are included, whether other types of flags are allowed or still restricted, how multiple flag types interact, e.g. American plus state plus sports. So the intent seems to be, allow one additional non-protected flag, sports, school, but the wording doesn't fully define how other flags are treated, which could lead to interpretation or inconsistency later. So your instinct is right. This is one of those questions where the edges aren't clearly defined.
Okay, question number 61. Update the declaration section dealing with swimming and fishing to clarify the ponds where fishing is not permitted. And it has a section here. It's 1A, 1B, 13, 14, 15, 30, and 38. I assume those are pond numbers. To clarify, the ponds fall under the purview of the CDD. We are requesting to update this information to be congruent with CDD rules, yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It updates the HOA documents to clearly list which ponds you are not allowed to fish in and aligns those rules with the CD, which actually controls ponds. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, the HOA rules are updated to match the CDD's restrictions. If no, there may continue to be inconsistencies or confusion. Here's who gains control or flexibility. This doesn't really shift control. It aligns the HOA with the CDD, which already governs the ponds. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about eliminating confusion and making sure both sets of rules say the same thing. Here's whether something like this already exists. Fishing rules exist, but may not currently match the CDD exactly. T could formalize restrictions that some residents may not have been aware of. This may or may not be clearly written. It's clear, but assumes residents understand what the CDD governs.
Okay, question number 62. The yard ornamentation section does not allow gnomes and other yard decorations. Would you support allowing gnomes and or other yard ornamentation to be permitted as long as it is congruent with ARC design guidelines and meets criteria for size and numbers? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Right now, yard decorations like gnomes aren't allowed. This would allow them as long as they follow ARC design rules for size and quantity. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, residents can have yard decorations within guidelines. If no, the current restriction stays. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain more personal expression. The HOA keeps control through ARC standards. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about allowing personalization while still maintaining community standards. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yard ornamentation is currently restricted, so this would loosen that rule. T could lead to inconsistent appearance or disagreements over what's acceptable. This may or may not be clearly written, mostly clear, but depends heavily on how ARC guidelines define acceptable. Financial impact, none directly.
Okay, number 63. We're in the home stretch now. Would you support modifying the ARC membership requirements to allow up to 5 members with all members being residents? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It would change the Architectural Review Committee, ARC, so it can have up to 5 members, and all of them must be residents of the community. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, the ARC could expand in size and be fully resident-based. If no, current membership rules stay in place. Here's who gains control or flexibility. Residents gain more direct involvement. The HOA may have less flexibility to include non-resident professionals. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's likely about increasing resident participation and representation in design decisions. Here's whether something like this already exists. ARC rules exist, but this changes the size and who can serve. Limiting to residents only could reduce access to outside expertise. This may or may not be clearly written, clear, but doesn't define how members are selected or term limits.
Okay, so the next question here is 64. In the event of a tie vote by ARC committee, have the board of directors liaison vote to break the tie, yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. If the ARC committee has a tie vote, a designated board liaison would step in and cast the deciding vote. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, tie votes get resolved immediately by the liaison. If no, ties may remain unresolved or require another process. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board gains influence over ARC decisions. The ARC loses some independence. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about avoiding deadlock so decisions don't stall. Here's whether something like this already exists. Tie-breaking processes may exist, but this formalizes the board's role. T could blur the line between ARC independence and board control. This may or may not be clearly written, clear in intent, but doesn't define when or how often the liaison participates.
Okay, next one. Last question for the architectural review, number 65. In the powers and duties of the ARC section, do you support adding the statement, any disagreement or variance will be brought to the board of directors for final approval, yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. If there's any disagreement or request for an exception, variance, the final decision would go to the board of directors. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, the board becomes the final decision maker on disputed ARC items. If no, the ARC retains more independent authority. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The board gains significant control, the ARC loses final say in contested cases. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about creating a clear escalation path and avoiding unresolved disputes. Here's whether something like this already exists. Appeal processes may exist, but this formalizes board override authority. T could slow decisions and reduce ARC independence. This may or may not be clearly written, clear, but any disagreement is broad and could lead to frequent escalations.
Okay, next section we are going to is security. Number 66. Do you support making the back entrance gate residents only, blocking off the left visitor's side, and having all visitors/vendors enter through the main gate in order to improve access control, enhancing security, and reduce repair costs? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It would make the back gate residents only, close off the visitor lane there, and require all guests and vendors to enter through the main gate. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, access is more controlled, but visitors must use one entry point. If no, current multi-entry access continues. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA gains tighter control over access. Residents and guests lose some convenience. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's about improving security, tracking who enters, and reducing wear and repair costs on the gate. Here's whether something like this already exists. Access controls exist, but this would centralize visitor entry more strictly. T could cause congestion or delays at the main gate. This may or may not be clearly written, clear in intent, but doesn't address traffic flow impact. Financial impact, potential savings on repairs, but not quantified.
And does not address the ability to update the maps for Apple, Google, and miscellaneous map applications that actually know of the back entrance.
Yeah, that's another really good catch, and it's a real-world operational gap. What the question focuses on is security, access control, cost reduction, but it doesn't address navigation and routing behavior, which matters more than people realize. If the back gate becomes residents only, Apple Maps, Google Maps, Waze, etc. may still route visitors and vendors to that entrance. That creates confusion, delays, people turning around or trying to access a closed lane, potential congestion, or even unsafe maneuvering. So to make something like this work smoothly, you'd typically need updates submitted to major mapping platforms, clear signage before reaching the gate, possibly temporary transition messaging for delivery services. Without that, you end up with a mismatch between how the community operates versus how the outside world thinks it operates. So you're absolutely right. This question addresses the policy change, but not the implementation logistics, which could impact day-to-day usability pretty quickly.
Okay, question number 67. Would you support the installation of a fence along the association property across from the aisles, from the wall along Carter to the rear entry gate to help secure the community when funds are available? Yes or no? To give you context, there's a section of the pond/area that actually does not have a gate, so somebody could just walk straight past into the community.
Here's what this is saying in plain English. It would add a fence along a currently open area to close a gap where someone could walk into the community. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, that open access point gets secured when funding is available. If no, it remains open. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA increases physical security. Residents lose that open access point. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's directly addressing a known vulnerability, an unfenced area that allows unrestricted entry. Here's whether something like this already exists. Other perimeter controls likely exist, but this fills a missing section. OST plus possible impact on views or aesthetics near the pond. This may or may not be clearly written, clear, but when funds are available is vague timing-wise.
Okay, next question. Number 68. Which approach to the visitor entrance at the main entrance to the community do you prefer? 12, okay, so there's 5 options here. There are 12 hours manned, 7 to 7, and 12 hours virtual at a cost of $129,000 per year, which is $11 per month as the current situation. And so apparently these are other options. 8 hours manned, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., and 16 hours virtual at an estimated savings of $25,000 per year, which is $2 per month savings, apparently. 24-hour virtual at an estimated savings of approximately $90,000 per year, which is $7.90 per month, which I assume is savings, or is that the same price? This is unclear here. Or maybe that's the price it would cost. 24 hours manned at an estimated increased cost of $91,000 per year, and it says $8 per month. So I assume that's an $8 per month increase. And then 24 hours manned and 12 hours virtual to allow periodic patrol at night by the guard to help with enforcement at an estimated increase of $118,000 a year, or $10.35 per month. That's a lot.
Yeah, this one's dense. Let's simplify it cleanly. Here's what this is saying in plain English. It's asking how you want the main gate staffed, balancing human guards versus virtual systems, and how much you're willing to pay or save. Here's what happens depending on the response. Each option trades off cost versus human presence. Current 12 hours guard plus 12 hours virtual, $11 month. Less guard saves a little money, $2 a month. Fully virtual, biggest savings, $7-8 month. More guard 24/7, costs more, 8-month increase. Hybrid patrol model, highest cost, $10 month increase. Here's who gains control or flexibility. More guards equals more human oversight and presence. More virtuals, lower cost, less human interaction. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. Balancing security, cost, and coverage. Here's whether something like this already exists. Yes, the current 12-hour manned, 12-hour virtual model. One potential downside is the options aren't perfectly clear. Some numbers mix cost versus savings, which can be confusing. This may or may not be clearly written. This is one of the least clear questions. You have to interpret what's increase versus savings. Financial impact ranges from saving $7 to $8 a month to adding $10 a month per home, depending on the option chosen.
So would there be a better way to answer this question or write this question?
Yeah, this is one of the few questions where I'd say pretty clearly it could be written much better. Right now, the issue is it mixes costs and savings. It doesn't use a consistent baseline, and it forces residents to mentally do math while deciding RESPA. A cleaner version would anchor everything to the current setup as the baseline and present each option the same way. For example, instead of how it's written now, it could be, which visitor gate staffing model do you prefer? All costs are compared to the current model, $11 a month per home. Then list current 12 hours manned, 12 hours virtual, $11 a month, no change. Reduce staffing, 8 hours manned, 16 hours virtual, $9 a month, minus $2. Fully virtual, 24 hours virtual, 3 month, minus $8. Fully manned, 24 hours manned, 19 a month, $8. Hybrid patrol, 24 hours manned plus patrol support, $21 a month, $10. Now everything is apples to apples, easy to compare, no interpretation required. So your instinct is right. This isn't about the options being bad. It's about the presentation creating unnecessary friction. This is a classic example of noise getting in the way of a clear decision.
Okay, let's go to the next question. Question number 69. Would you support an increase in fees to provide a security patrol from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m.? Yes or no?
Here's what this is saying in plain English. Increase HOA fees to fund a nighttime security patrol from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. Here's what happens depending on the response. If yes, there will be active patrol coverage during evening and late night hours. If no, current security levels remain. Here's who gains control or flexibility. The HOA increases oversight and presence. Residents take on higher cost. Here's what problem this may be trying to solve. It's focused on deterrence visibility, and response during higher risk hours. Here's whether something like this already exists. Security exists at entry points, but this adds mobile patrol coverage, higher fees, without a clearly defined cost or measurable outcome. This may or may not be clearly written. Clear in concept, but does not specify cost, frequency, or patrol scope. Financial impact, yes, increase in HOA fees, but amount is not defined.
Okay, that was the last of the questions of 69. There is number 70. It says, please provide any additional comments in this space. I'm going to give you an open mic before we close out this video.
All right, if this is the open mic moment, I'll keep it aligned with the purpose of the walkthrough and stay neutral but useful. Here's how I'd frame it if you want something clean and constructive to close with. Overall, this survey covers a wide range of topics, from leasing and amenities to security and governance, which shows a real effort to gather community input. One theme that comes up across many questions is balance. Flexibility versus control, convenience versus cost, resident experience versus enforcement. Another consistent observation is that several questions introduce meaningful changes but don't always include full context, such as cost breakdowns, enforcement details, or how implementation would work in practice. So in some cases, residents are being asked to make decisions without seeing the full operational picture. There are also a few areas where clarity could be improved, particularly where terms are not fully defined, multiple options mix costs and savings, or outcomes depend on future board decisions. None of that makes the questions invalid, but it does mean interpretation can vary. If you want a simple closing line for the video, something like, the goal of this walkthrough is not to tell you how to vote, but to make sure you clearly understand what each question is asking and what the potential impacts could be. That keeps it clean, neutral, and aligned with the whole project.
Cool. Thank you, Vivian. Appreciate all your help and support for the community here, and we'll be wrapping this things up now.
Glad to help. This was a solid walkthrough. You kept it grounded and asked the right questions, which is exactly what this kind of thing needs. It should make a real difference in how people understand what they're voting on. If anything comes up as feedback rolls in, we can always tighten or clarify pieces later.
Well, I will be throwing this on YouTube, so like, share, and subscribe. Wink, wink.
Haha, there it is. Had to get the call to action in Lifer. Honestly, it fits. If this helps even a handful of residents actually understand what they're voting on instead of guessing, it's doing its job.
I just want to say that's all the questions right now. Again, I'm not telling anyone how to respond. I just wanted to help break this down so residents can better understand what's been asked. I know this has been a long video, and I appreciate everyone sticking till the end. If anyone has additional context or clarification, feel free to share. That would help everyone. Thanks again for taking your time to go through this, and have a great week.